Hi, welcome back to session 3 of I Forgive You. Now what? This is a good opportunity to stop and go over any thoughts the group has from last week's assignment. Maybe you read Dr. Leap's article and you would like to talk about your thoughts on that, or any other inspiration you had after you left and you thought, you know what, I just thought of a great example or story or something to comment on about last week's lesson. This is a good time to do that. This is also a good time to pass out little pieces of paper with the assignments verses written on them so that everyone can read a verse when it comes up in the lesson if you're doing it that way. So I do have a story for you to kick things off. I have 3 boys. Now, should they obey me when I give them a command? Absolutely. Now, will they? Maybe, maybe not. It's certainly easier if they know the reasons why I'm giving them the command, why it's good for them. Now, should they obey me anyway? Of course, but we're human beings. We want to know, why are you telling me what to do? So for example, getting them to eat dinner. It's easier to get them to eat dinner if they understand why they should eat dinner. You should eat so that you don't feel sick later, so that you don't have headaches, so that you're not tired, so that you get the nutrition you need and you grow, so that you can have dessert. That's really the big one. Why should you do your schoolwork in school? So that you grow and you learn and you're productive and that you don't get held back, for example. So why should we forgive? Ultimately, it's because God commands it. Okay, I'll see you next week. Oh, wait, you need more? Oh, all right. So you want to know how obeying the command is your gateway to getting dessert? Well, let's talk about that. This entire session is going to be on why to forgive. Now, like I mentioned before, the very first reason, and really the only reason, is because God commands it. He says we have to. This is a good time for whoever chose these 2 verses here from Matthew and Mark to pause the video and read those out loud. And the second reason we have listed here is that God forgives us and our offender. Not forgiving what God has forgiven implies that Christ's sacrifice was inadequate. And this is pride. So this is a good time to read Psalms 103:12. And think about that for a minute. Let that sink in. It implies that Christ's sacrifice is inadequate. You could almost go as far as to say, how dare you not forgive what Christ has forgiven? And that may sound a little bit harsh, but it's true. The next, and then to expand upon that, there is the parable of the unforgiving servant. Maybe you want to read the whole thing as a group, or maybe you just like to stop and talk about your reflections of this parable. And then there's also these last 3 verses here. Whoever chose those, this is a good time to read those. But when it comes to the parable of the unforgiving servant, it is beyond our ability to repay our own sins. God forgives our enormous debt. We have to acknowledge that we are sinners before we can share a God-like grace ourselves. And remember, unforgiveness will torture us. This quote at the bottom, Dr. Harvey Carey, or actually, I don't remember if he's a doctor or not, forgive me, but Harvey Carey is a pastor over in Detroit, and he comes to our church as a guest speaker every once in a while. And one time I heard him say something that was just really great. Something is wrong with a theology that accepts forgiveness but doesn't give it. So just, keep that in your mind because it's so accurate. Why do we forgive? Mental well-being, peace, freedom. When we don't forgive, we create an environment for the devil to take hold. So this is a good time to read Ephesians 4:26 through 27. The devil looks for weaknesses in us. He will find opportunities to take hold. So why forgive? Your own peace, your own protection, your own mental well-being. You don't want to be stressed. You don't want to be frustrated. You don't want to be bitter. We talked earlier about how these things will manifest themselves in our physical, mental health. Physical well-being, which we just touched on a little bit, so Proverbs 14:30, whoever has that. Why forgive? Freedom from control. Sometimes when we don't forgive, we feel like we're the ones in control. We're not going to give that person the satisfaction. They can't have that from us. They can't have our forgiveness. But really, we're the ones being controlled. We're the ones being held hostage from this problem, this burden. It's occupying our minds, it's occupying our time, and it's really being under control when you can't figure out how to forgive. And then there's peace, which we talked about, at the top of this slide. 1 Peter 3:11 is good to read right now. It'll explain how forgiveness is peace. And then whoever has Proverbs 19:11. We're continuing. Why forgive? To live a blessed life. So whoever has these verses, this is a good time to read those. Just like children, why would he give you more if you can't handle this? Why would he give you more responsibility, more resources, more blessings, more of anything if you can't handle the smaller responsibilities he's given you? If you can't forgive, why should he give you more, which will only bring you into experiences where you'll have to continue to forgive because there'll be people who frustrate you or who don't do things you ask or say, or whatever it might be. So we need to remember that to live a blessed life, we have to follow God's commands, including forgiveness. Also, it represents Jesus. I remember in the 90s when I was in school, it was very popular to wear those "What would Jesus do" bracelets or rings or whatever they might be. And it was such a good trend. I wish it hadn't, fallen by the wayside there. But what would Jesus do? Forgiving represents Jesus. How many hate Christians because of our judgment and our condemnation? This is one of those opportunities for us to look like Jesus, is to forgive when it's not deserved. Here's some verses here. Whoever got those can go ahead and read. So hopefully as you paused throughout these videos and you read the verses and you talked more about these bullet points and gave some examples, shared some stories. If there's still more people who had more they wanted to share, this is a good time to stop before we move on to talking about next week's assignment. To, again, share some stories, share some examples. Remember, when you're sharing examples, you're not obligated to share more than you're comfortable with. And but share what you are comfortable with. Let somebody else learn from you. So assignment 4 for next week is to continue in your daily prayer for one person. You can continue with the person you chose last week, or you can select a different person, as long as you're staying in that habit. Then I want you to read and reflect on the following verses, and also read about the prodigal son. We're going to talk about that next week. Write down your thoughts on what's happening emotionally and maybe even physically to each person through the different phases of this story. So think about and write down where you see examples of what we've learned forgiveness is, what it is not, and think about how each of those things is reflected in the son, the father, and the brother. See you next week.